itself.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, so Manisha, thank you so much for inviting me and Tanya to present on Indigenous women's right, word therapy, and strength-based stories. First, I'm going to start off with a land acknowledgement. So I acknowledge that I reside on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. Treaty 6 encompasses the traditional territories of numerous First Nations, including Cree, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Ojibwe, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that Tanya resides on the traditional lands known as Treaty 8 territory. This is the shared lands of the Yellowknife's Dene First Nations people and the Métis. I pay my respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 and reaffirm our relationship with one another. My name is Shelley Wiart, and I am a member of the North Slave Métis Alliance, Yellowknife Northwest Territories. I'm so excited to be here today to present on this very special topic, Indigenous women right, strength-based stories and word therapy. So I did the land acknowledgement, and I just wanted to let you know that I reside on both Treaty 6 and Treaty 8. So right now I live in Lloydminster, Alberta, and usually in the summer I live in Yellowknife Northwest Territories. I'm currently finishing my degree, my Bachelor of Arts degree through Athabasca University, major sociology, minor women and gender studies. I have 3 courses until I'm done. I use she, her pronouns. I am a proud mother to 3 daughters, Kayla, age 11, Aubrey, age 9, and Harper, age 7. I just want to talk a little bit about my writing experience so that everybody knows what my background is. I do not have a Master of Fine Arts. A lot of my writing experience is just practical experience. I was a bi-weekly columnist for the Yellowknife newspaper in 2018, where I wrote the Women Warriors column, and it was about Indigenous women's holistic health. In 2019, I was awarded 3rd place for the Camosa Scholarship for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Mothers Who Write, hosted by the Writers Guild of Alberta. This past year, I was awarded first runner-up for the Sally Manning Award for Indigenous Creative Non-Fiction for UpHere magazine. And then just recently, I published an academic article on my digital storytelling research titled Decolonizing Healthcare, Indigenous Digital Storytelling as Pedagogical Tool for Cultural Safety in Healthcare Settings. So I just wanted to let you know that Tanya is taking her lunch hour from 12 to 1 o'clock. So she works full time at the Yellowknife Library. So I'm really happy that she could come during her lunch hour and discuss everything with us. So in her absence, I'm going to introduce her. Okay, so Tanya is an Inuk writer and throat singer living in Yellowknife Northwest Territories. Her family roots are from the, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Tanya will definitely pronounce it better, but Kivalliq region of Nunavut, an area on the northwest coast of the Hudson Bay. She's been writing for about 10 years as an urban Inuk and as an Indigenous child in the Northwest Territories foster care system. Her writing can be found in UpHere magazine, Edge Yellowknife, the Writers Union of Canada, and the Literary Review of Canada. She loves books, and as I said, she works full-time at the Yellowknife Library. Today's agenda. I'm going to share how Tanya and I met through our Indigenous Women's Digital Health Stories. I'm going to define the following concepts so that we have a baseline of understanding for when Tanya and I share our insights on writing. So I'm going to talk about deficit stories versus strength-based stories, trauma porn, cultural appropriation, imposter syndrome, relational accountability, and my own identity as a white-coated Métis woman. Tanya will join us in about 10 minutes to discuss word therapy and writing routines and all of these concepts that I'm going to define. So this portion of the presentation will be premised on the Visiting Way methodology, which is an Indigenous methodology that centers on relating to one another in a non-restrictive, unscripted, and responsive way. We are sharing in this format because visiting is an important feature of Indigenous culture. And it is a demonstration on how we discuss writing through Indigenous ways of knowing, relating, and doing. Since I am an Indigenous writer and researcher, I want to be aware of how I produce knowledge and if it is being done in a good way. After we finish our visit with Tanya, she will share her original poem, I Am, and we'll be sharing some of our favorite writing resources. If you would like to ask questions during our presentation, please feel free to do so. We will also hold a short Q&A, about 10 minutes or less, at the end of our presentation. I will provide contact information for anyone that would like to get in touch with Tanya or myself. Tanya and I met last summer in Yellowknife when she created a digital health story for our research project, Digital Storytelling as an Indigenous Women's Health Advocacy Tool, empowering Indigenous women to frame their health stories. If you would like to view the digital health stories or sign up for my biweekly newsletter about Indigenous women's holistic health, or my Medium blog about COVID-19 and Indigenous peoples, please visit my website, womanwarriors.club. Okay, so this is all about controlling the narrative and the difference between deficit-based and strength-based stories. In the past, the narrative surrounding Indigenous peoples has been from a deficit lens. It has encouraged harmful discourses of pathology and stigma surrounding Indigenous peoples. Hayat and colleagues defined a deficit discourse as a mode of thinking that frames and represents Aboriginal identity in a narrative of negativity, deficiency, and disempowerment. These stereotypes of deficiency have exacerbated rather than addressed persistent health and social disparities and continue to harm Indigenous peoples. It is essential to the decolonization process that Indigenous people speak with their own voices about our histories, culture, and experiences as we continue to resist the onslaught of colonial structures, policies, and practices. Indigenous peoples writing and sharing our own stories combat these deficit narratives and allow us to assert our own self-determined knowledge. We need to encourage Indigenous peoples to write our own strength-based narratives about existing capacities in Indigenous communities and the ability to address our own health and social issues. Trauma porn. Trauma porn is a term that Alan Meek uses in his book, Trauma and Media. It refers to a fascination with the traumatic images of suffering by audiences that is not necessarily genuine. It's not about empathy. It's not about genuine consideration. It's much more about fetishism. It's about voyeurism. It's about spectatorship, about the spectacular aspect. Trauma porn is when plights and traumas of a culture or race are used for entertainment and the story, in effect, diminishes their historical pain. It's especially painful if it's just to appeal to a wider demographic than to educate the audience on the actual problem. A recent example of trauma porn and the controversy of writing for a white audience is the book American Dirt by Jeanine Cummins. One of the biggest grievances critics had about the book was that Mexican stories shouldn't only be defined by immigration, drug cartels, and violence. Yes, these things can be part of the story, but let's not reduce them only to those themes just because they make for a good read. In terms of Indigenous literature, there is an ethical dilemma surrounding writing trauma and if the audience is reading it as voyeurism into Indigenous communities or to better understand their own positions of white privilege and their contributions to the oppression of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. A resource that I would recommend for a good understanding of trauma ethics is Writing Trauma, a panel discussion conceptualized by Roxane Gay. And you can look that up on YouTube. It's about an hour and 30 minutes, and there's a lot of Black, Indigenous, people of color writers on that panel, and they do a very thorough job of discussing trauma porn and the ethics of writing trauma. Cultural appropriation. The academic article, What is the Wrong of Cultural Appropriation, defines the concept as the appropriation of something of cultural value, usually a symbol or a practice, to others. The contextual conditions that can render acts of cultural appropriation more egregious include the existence of a power imbalance between the cultural appropriator and those from whom the practice or symbol is appropriated, and the presence of profit that accrues to the appropriator. So it's making a profit off of Indigenous people's stories or their culture. Leonard and colleagues distinguish between 3 types of cultural appropriation: subject appropriation, object appropriation, and content appropriation. Subject appropriation involves using characters or stories from another culture. Object appropriation involves the taking of physical cultural objects, such as Indigenous artifacts, and displaying them at museums without their consent. Cultural content includes symbols and practices, as well as forms of especially traditional dress and physical presentation. Cultural appropriation can be defined as taking of a valuable yet reusable or non-exhaustible aspect of another individual culture, it's usually a symbol or a practice, for one's own use, where the taker knows that he or she is doing it, and where the context of this taking is contested. Consider how offensive the Cultural Appropriation Prize, published in the May 2017 Right magazine, was to Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. In it, the former Right editor, who resigned after he wrote the column, defends the practice of cultural appropriation. In my opinion, anyone, anywhere should be encouraged to imagine other peoples, other cultures, other identities. I just want to talk a little bit about this Cultural Appropriation Prize. Tanya actually had a story in this Cultural Appropriation Right magazine. So we're going to discuss it a little bit later in our conversation together. But Alicia Elliott was really outspoken about what happened with this Cultural Appropriation Prize. I don't know if you've read her book, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, but it is an amazing book, and I highly recommend that everybody reads it. And there's just a couple paragraphs in her book where she talks about cultural appropriation. And I just want to read a paragraph so that you have a better understanding of why non-Indigenous writers should never write Indigenous stories. To truly write from another experience in an authentic way, you need more than empathy. You need to write with love. That is what I felt when I read Simpson's stories. That is what I feel when I read the works of other Indigenous authors. That's what I hope Indigenous people feel when they read my work, love. If you can't write about us with a love for who we are as a people, what we've survived, and what we've accomplished despite all attempts to keep us from doing so, if you can't look at us as we are and feel your pupils go wide, rendering all stereotypes a sham, a poor copy, a disgrace, then why are you writing about us at all? Imposter syndrome is the faulty feeling of not measuring up, or that you don't really deserve a compliment or accomplishment. People struggling with imposter syndrome often feel like a fraud and often live with the fear that at any moment others will find out that their success is unearned. Dr. Shapiro, an expert on imposter syndrome, states there are 5 different reactions to imposter syndrome, otherwise known as how the syndrome drives you to act in everyday life. The perfectionist, someone who feels as if they need to do everything perfectly or else they've failed. And if they aren't perfect, they have an overwhelming feeling of self-doubt. The superhero, someone who feels as if they're a fraud, either at work or in a relationship, and so they work extra hard to hide their supposed inadequacy. Often, the overload and worker stress of not measuring up is damaging to their mental health. The natural genius, someone who judges their worth by how easily something comes to them. If they need to work to master a task or to make a friend, they feel ashamed. The soloist, someone who feels that they need to do everything themselves. If they need to ask for help, they feel incompetent. The expert, someone who judges their worth by how much they know. They constantly feel as if they're not smart enough and fear being exposed as unknowledgeable. I wanted to share these 5 reactions to imposter syndrome because I hear these excuses when I encourage women to write. You do not need to have a master's in fine arts to be a writer. Write for yourself. Write to better understand yourself and heal your wounds. Write because you feel compelled to share the stories that were passed down to you by your family. Write because your survivance stories are needed for our children and future generations. Relational accountability is a term from Indigenous health research. So I'm borrowing some of my experience with Indigenous health research and applying it to writing. It means the methodology needs to be based in a community context, so be relational, and has to demonstrate respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. So be accountable as it is put into action. Relational accountability means that the researcher, or in this case, the Indigenous writer, is accountable to the community members and that the writing must accurately reflect and build upon the relationships between the ideas and the participants. I share this concept of relational accountability because it is an important feature in Indigenous communities. It is a concept that safeguards Indigenous communities from harmful, extractive, and deficit-based research done by outsiders, or from cultural appropriation by non-Indigenous writers. When we write about our communities and relationships, we are held accountable to them. I am white-coated Métis, and that is a term that Chelsea Bowell uses to describe herself. The lightness of my skin means that people interpret my identity as white. I understand that I hold privilege because my skin is white passing. This means that I work very hard to self-reflect on my privilege and to always advocate for my darker skin relatives and community members. So on the left is a picture of myself with all of my uncles and aunts and my dad. I also understand that I should never take up space from an Indigenous woman that experiences racism based on the color of her skin. It is my responsibility to know when to shut up and give the floor to women that can speak of their lived oppression in ways that I do not know. It also means I never use my identity to benefit myself if I am not actively making the lives of Indigenous peoples better. There are some Métis that only identify as such when it benefits them for job applications or scholarships. That is a form of systemic oppression, and ethnic fraud is rampant in our society. For example, Joseph Boyden stole opportunities from other Indigenous authors by claiming Métis identity to benefit his writing career. Be aware if and when you are taking opportunities from other Indigenous peoples and how you are actively promoting those that do not hold the same privileges as you because of your skin color. So before I introduce Tanya, or if I see if she's on here yet. Tanya, are you on here yet?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, yay.
I didn't want to interrupt you.
All right, so I'm really excited to share this space with you. And the first thing that I'm gonna do is there anything that you would like to say to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, yeah, my name is Tanya Roach. I live in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. I work at a library. My family heritage is Inuit and Scottish. So I have family in the Kivalliq region of Nunavut. So that's like Rankin Inlet and avid and places like that. And yeah, Shelley and I met with the project that she worked on for her university course. So now we're here.
Yay! Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to talk about is word therapy and my writing routine, and then maybe Tanya can talk about it, her own writing routine, and then I'm going to explain the visiting way methodology. and then we're just going to have a chat. Okay.
Good.
Okay, so first off, I started writing very extensively in 2017 after some deep emotional trauma. My brother, who is alcohol dependent, ended up in the ICU unit, and I had a lot of trauma from childhood that I had never faced, and I ended up getting this trauma rash on my skin. So at night I would like itch uncontrollably all over my legs, and it would keep me up at night. And I went to the doctor, and he said, like, there's nothing there, I can't see anything, I can't prescribe you anything. So it was a psychosomatic manifestation of my trauma. And I had to figure out what to do in order to get the trauma out of me. So what I ended up doing that summer, it was the summer of 2017, I went to Yellowknife, and every single morning I got up and I wrote in a journal, and I followed the artist way. And so that's by Julie Cameron, and I highly recommend it to anyone that wants to do any kind of artistic pursuit. And I wrote probably 1,000 pages of everything that had ever happened to me. And it was a really healing experience. And by the end of the summer, I was back to kind of my old self. The trauma skin had ceased, and I felt a lot better. And then after that, I entered Al-Anon, which really, really helped me, and CODA, which is for codependence. And most of my writing from 2017 to now is about my codependent relationship with my brother and my Métis identity, and then Indigenous women's health. So every morning I get up, usually around 5:30, I make coffee, I have candlelight and my cat, and from 6 till about 7 to 7:15, I write. And so it's just stream of consciousness writing. And I brought all my journals from 2020 just so you can see how much I write. Sometimes it's like more or less, but this is just this year from January 2020. And I don't actually publish most of the stuff that I write. It's like for my own healing. It's not really meant for a lot of people to read it. And so it's only October, so I can probably get like a couple more of these. I just buy them at the dollar store. It's like $2.50. I used to write in like really beautiful journals that were like $14 a journal, but now because I write so much, it's like such a waste of money. So I just like use these, and like I said, it's like stream of consciousness writing, and I just get out like everything that I can and get it out, because otherwise if I keep it in, I end up with that trauma skin, and I end up with that uncontrollable itching. Yeah, so that's my writing practice. And then on top of that, I'm a university student, so I write every day for school. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it over to Tanya.
Thanks. So I'm a published writer, and I've been writing since I was little. So it's something that I've always done without really thinking about it. And when I was in my early 20s, I'd met some writers at the University of Alberta. And realize that this is something that I can proactively do to voice my life experience, my opinions, and Indigenous activism. I'm a sporadic writer. Like, I would love to be an early morning writer, but that's not me. I love writing late at night. And a lot of it is just personal stories. I spent 15 years in the NWT foster care system. And so I've pretty much spent all my adult life trying to find my head and be a functioning adult. And writing has really helped with that. So I find that I'm an evening writer. I love writing when the world has gone to sleep, so I could feel like I am who I am naturally without having to put a face on, because you have to put your face on when you go to work and you go to school and things like that. So I'm a night owl for sure. I'm a reluctant writer. I spent like a lot of years feeling like I'm not good enough. But like the more Indigenous writers that I see being published and sharing their story motivates me a lot. So I love like Richard Van Camp, Helen Knott, Joshua Whitehead, Cherie Dimaline. And I find that the more that I read Indigenous stories, the more that I feel compelled to write my own story. And so last month, one of my favorite spoken word artists is this man named Rudy Francisco, and he lives in California, and he's very outspoken about his life experience as a man and as a Black man in the States. And so he did a 4-week writing workshop, a poetry workshop that was a lot of fun. I don't write as much as I want. Like, I would love to spend all my days writing, but we have jobs, we have life, we have kids, we have all those things. So I write when I can.
Okay, so I'm going to share the visiting methodology, and then you and I are just going to talk about kind of the concepts that I shared before, because now everybody has that foundational knowledge, and we can also like have a conversation with the audience as opposed to just like leaving the Q&A to the end, so that it's more of a visit with everyone.
Okay.
Okay, so the visiting way methodology, Tanya came to visit me actually in September. And so we had such a good visit in this office right here. And I showed her like every Indigenous book that I love. And we talked about books and writing the whole time. And so then here is my own family. This is at the Elks in Yellowknife at the top right-hand picture. And every Thursday we get together at the Elks and we have steak night and we visit. And then at the bottom here, it was Indigenous Women's Digital Storytelling. We all got together and had dinner in Yellowknife. And so I don't know, I just love visiting, and I feel like it's just the Indigenous way. Anyway, there's an actual methodology called the visiting way. So Métis academic Gaudette stated, the way of visiting is part of land-based society's way of life. It guides the way we conduct ourselves, treat one another, and learn from one another and from the land itself. For Indigenous peoples, visiting creates and fortifies connections that unify and build community from the ground up. It is how humor, silence, news, concerns, pain, knowledge, ideas, and arguments are disseminated at a grassroots ground level. Visiting may seem on the surface to be passive and apolitical activity, but it is in fact political, recentering authority in a way of relating that it is itself rooted in a cultural, spiritual, and social context. It provides a means of understanding Indigenous ways of knowing, relating, and doing. In seeing visiting as political, we can reconsider our conceptions of politics, who can do political work, and how political work has historically been done. Oops. Back to visiting. Here we go. All right, so Tanya and I met on Monday and we had a short discussion about what we were going to discuss today. And the first place I want to start is the understanding of deficit stories versus strength-based stories. So do you remember what you told me on Monday about that concept?
No, not totally. I remember like, yes, but in the moment, you know.
Okay. Well, do you just want to like share how the reframing of strength-based stories helped you in writing?
Yeah. So one really nice thing that I've learned from Shelley after having these conversations is recognizing where a story is coming from. You know, I find that having spent so many years in the foster care system, I have totally, and I've adopted the victim mentality because I haven't lived in a structured and empowering and safe space for so long that I didn't realize the kind of self-talk and narrative that was going on inside of my head, or even the way that I perceived my story. You know, I thought very negatively about my life experience, you know, as like a mixed Inuk white foster kid, all these kinds of things. I always thought I didn't feel very good about myself. So after having these conversations with Shelley and recognizing these kinds of stories, you can shift the way that you perceive yourself and even the way that you carry yourself. So instead of looking at my history as defeating, oppressing, and like it's not like my life story is not an actual reflection of how strong and healthy and beautiful Inuit people are. But because of my life experience, I perceived that story to be an inheritance from my culture when really it isn't. So I find that understanding these kinds of things, like it really empowers me to shift the way that I see my story and the way that I tell my story, which I love, because, you know, non-Indigenous people asking questions about us, like what is the tone and what kind of information are they extracting? Is it deficit-based or is it strength-based? And a lot of the times it is deficit-based. So now I'm able to recognize that before I have a conversation with another non-Indigenous person, which is empowering because we get to switch the power dynamics to put us on an equal playing field with other Canadians.
I want to say, like, for myself in my own Indigenous Women's Digital Health Stories research, naturally Indigenous women wanted to tell strength-based stories. They didn't want to focus on deficit-based stories. They wanted to talk about their resilience and the way that their community works together to overcome hardships. And I think that there's so many amazing Indigenous writers that talk about the resilience and beauty of Indigenous culture. And that's why I mostly only read Indigenous women writers, because I feel like they do such a good job at evoking those feelings of community and love for their culture. And even though that there are some real hardships, again, like Alicia Elliott said, you know, it always comes from a place of love. So the next thing, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or ask us. We'd love to.
I think there's a feature where you can raise your hand too, and then we can point people out as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay. I don't have, like, maybe Manisha could kind of like keep up with the chat, because I don't even have it on my screen right now because I'm screen sharing. So the other thing that I want to talk about is cultural appropriation. And I don't know if you heard that, Tanya, but I was talking about that writer's prize, that they were trying to have a cultural appropriation prize where the editor of Write magazine really encouraged like non-Indigenous people to write Indigenous stories. And you had a story actually in that magazine in 2017. How did you feel about that controversy?
So living in the North, sometimes there's like a delay of relaying information. So I hadn't actually, I wasn't up to speed on what was going down. I hadn't received the magazine like a week later. I received the magazine like a week after everyone else did. I don't know. I just like, when I was working with Neil Nadzavecki, I forget how to pronounce his name, but with the editor that was putting this prize on, I could tell early on that there was just something about him that just wasn't culturally sensitive. I find that the approach with Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, especially in Southern Canada, is very, very different. So I find that when I'm working with Indigenous people, there's more sense of like patience and compassion and like an equal relationship. But with him, it was very much, this is the information that I need, give it to me, and then we're going to throw it out there. It didn't feel like a collaboration. And I feel like you need to have that kind of relationship when you're working with an editor. But I don't know, it just seems like common sense. Don't take someone else's culture and then misinterpret it if you're not actually from this culture. So it seems like common sense, but it's not common sense for a lot of non-Indigenous people. I was told not to steal in all physically, mentally, and emotionally. And I don't know if those are kind of values that other people are taught, but that's me.
Mm-hmm. For myself, cultural appropriation, like I would never, ever write a story from the perspective of anything but Métis. I would never try and pretend that I am a Cree woman on reserve and write a story about that, because there's just so much holistic understanding that I don't have about that culture that I could not do it justice. And there's so many ceremonies and ways of being that are secret within their society that it's such a violation. Why would I try and get in there and expose the knowledge that they have for their own culture that they want to keep? And then, like, in terms of making space for other Indigenous women, I told you, like, I'm very aware of my own white privilege and the way that I look. And anything that I do, I'm always trying to promote other Indigenous women in. And I think we need to work really hard to lift each other up all the time. And once we get an opportunity, we need to share that opportunity with other Indigenous women. This is not a competition. We need help, and we need to help each other all the time. So that kind of lateral violence that I experience sometimes, especially because I'm a white-coated Métis, even though I'm very deeply entrenched in my culture and in my family, I just think it's like an ugly colonial legacy. That's how I view it. And I really am aware of promoting other Indigenous writers and giving more opportunities to Indigenous women that I know and that I love. And I'm always promoting Indigenous people. So the other thing I want to talk about is imposter syndrome, because I get it from a lot of Indigenous women when I say, like, oh, you should write about that. And then they're like, nah, like, I'm not really a writer. I'm not really educated. I don't really have the time, like, or they think it has to be perfect. So I want to ask Tanya what she thinks about imposter syndrome.
I totally have imposter syndrome. And it's these conversations with Shelley that help make me realize that it's like it's a self-inflicted wound that I've adopted in my time as a foster kid. I don't validate my own experience enough. So when I read other Indigenous writers, it's empowering to hear their stories. And so when I see other Indigenous writers, I applaud them and I'm excited, but when it comes to me, I need to develop a healthier relationship. I think because there was so much racism and neglect in the foster care system, I don't feel like I occupy space enough and I don't validate my experience enough. So like if I'm in the workplace or if I'm in a writing workshop and I have a question or if I have an opinion, I have to like push myself on the inside to make myself heard. And I find that when I do, I think non-Indigenous people are so used to Indigenous people and women in particular for not speaking up, that when they do, there's a lot of like backlash or criticism. And that makes it twice as hard because I have to convince myself that what I have to say is worth it. I have to have like a personal argument with myself to say, you need to say this, you need to speak up. If you're experiencing this, and someone else might be too. So it's when I visit with other Indigenous ladies and we talk about these things, it's empowering and other women know what it feels like. So I don't feel so alone.
I mean, for me, imposter syndrome, I heard it the entire time I was doing digital storytelling, like, well, what am I going to say about Indigenous women's health? Or like as if their opinions don't matter sometimes. And I really, I think it's so important that we need to hold space for other people's stories and really encourage them in a way that's culturally appropriate and also loving kindness about people's lived experience. And there's a lot of strength that comes out of these stories that they don't even know about. So it's just like a matter of getting people to start talking about it. And then it's like, wow, that's amazing what you overcame, or look at the way that, those coping techniques that you had. So I really learned how to hold space for Indigenous women's stories, and then also just to encourage them to explore their own histories. As part of imposter syndrome, I would say that for a long time, I didn't ask to be paid for the things that I did. I didn't feel like they were valid, or I didn't feel like people would pay me for my writing. And so I think that's something that we all need to work on, is like really valuing our work and asking to be paid for it. And so we just have like about a couple more minutes to have this like free conversation. So if anyone else wants to get in on it, please do so. The next question that I'm going to ask Tanya is about being half white and half Inuit, and how that comes out in your writing, or how you write about your identity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I grew up in Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, with a very strong, opinionated and dominating mother. So she's not even 5 feet tall, but she just has a very dominating presence. And my dad, who is a very tall white man, was quite passive and submissive, very kind. So growing up, my perspective of racism, like I didn't understand what racism was. It wasn't something that my family talked about. So growing up, my mom, this is super weird, but my mom she was married to a white man, but she was also conflicted. You know, I don't know. When I became an adult and I recognized the systemic oppression that was present in the workplace or at school or in my son's school, it wasn't really a thing for me. Like, I always thought that we were all equal, but that's not the way that society perceives us. And growing up with a very strong and opinionated mother, I always thought that Indigenous people were the dominant people in Canadian society. So when I became an adult and I started like facing all this prejudice and racism, I was like, wait a minute, that's not what I was told when I was a little girl. Like, it doesn't fit right with me, but that's the way it is for a lot of Indigenous people, and especially in Southern Canada. It's like the more north you go, the more Indigenous presence is visible. So I'm very lucky that I had a very strong-willed mother during the time that I was with her, because I haven't been exposed to like long-term oppression from like my Caucasian family. And I didn't realize this until I had like these conversations with Shelley, where it was like, my perspective, like it changes the narrative between who actually has power and who doesn't have power. We all have power, but I think a lot of times, because there's like intentional oppression on Indigenous people, we think we don't have power. So having these conversations with Shelley and getting these thoughts out of my head, she helps with like her academic training and all those things like that. She helps pinpoint to say, this is like a cultural pattern, or this is a mindset that you're following. So I find conversations with other women very helpful. And I don't know if there's a lot of other Indigenous women who have that same perspective, where our Indigenous culture is the dominant one, you know, and I feel like I need to use that in a strength-based way, especially when I tell my stories.
So I'm just looking at the time, Tanya. It's 12:42. I was just wondering if you could read your poem before you have to leave. And I had kind of said to Manisha that you don't want this recorded, this
Yep.
poem.
Yep.
So I just want to make sure that she's not